So, we start discussion on temperature regulation. Now, temperature regulation, regulation of body temperature is very important. Regulation of body temperature is very important for several reasons. One is speed of chemical reactions taking place in the body depend on body temperature. Speed of chemical reactions taking place in the body depend on body temperature. Enzyme systems of the body function optimally within a narrow range of temperature. So enzyme systems of the body function optimally within a narrow range of temperature. Body temperature is maintained within a normal narrow range by the balance between heat loss and heat gain. So body temperature is maintained within a narrow normal range by the balance between heat loss and heat gain. The main mechanisms of heat loss are conduction, convection, radiation and evaporation, whereas heat is gained through metabolic processes, intake of food and exercise. So main mechanisms of heat loss are conduction, convection, radiation and evaporation, whereas heat is gained through metabolic process intake of food and exercise. Now, characteristics of normal body temperature. In a normal adult man, the oral temperature has a normal range between 36.3 degrees centigrade to 37.1 degrees centigrade, that is in Fahrenheit scale 97.3 degree to 98.8 degree. The rectal temperature is an accurate index of core temperature of the body and it is unaffected by environmental changes. So the rectal temperature is an accurate index of core temperature of the body and it is unaffected by environmental changes. Oral temperature is 0.5 degree centigrade lower than rectal temperature. Oral temperature is 0.5 degree centigrade lower than rectal temperature, but it is frequently recorded, but it varies with the temperature of ingested liquids, smoking, breathing through mouth, etc. So oral temperature is frequently recorded, but it varies with the temperature of ingested liquids, smoking, breathing through mouth, etc. Now scrotal temperature is maintained at 32 degrees centigrade. Presence of testis in the cooler temperature outside the abdominal cavity is essential for spermatogenesis. Abdominal or undescended testis which remains at a much warmer temperature inside the abdomen is usually sterile. So abdominal or undescended testis is usually sterile. Now body temperature undergoes a diurnal variation with the temperature low early in the morning and high towards the evening. So body temperature undergoes a diurnal variation, temperature being low early in the morning and high towards the evening. In women, basal body temperature rises with ovulation and remains elevated in the secretory phase, possibly due to the action of progesterone. So in women, basal body temperature rises with ovulation and remains elevated in the secretory phase, possibly due to the action of progesterone. Core temperature may rise up to 40 degrees centigrade in exercise. This probably occurs as excess heat produced during exercise overbalances heat loss. So core temperature may rise to 40 degrees centigrade in exercise. This probably occurs as excess heat produced during exercise overbalances heat loss. Emotional factors may also raise body temperature, probably by increasing muscle tension. So emotional factors may also raise body temperature, probably by increasing muscle tension. Some people have increased temperature without any apparent reason. This is known as constitutional hyperthermia. So some people have increased temperature without any apparent reason and this is known as constitutional hyperthermia. Now we come to mechanism of heat production. Now the main mechanisms of heat production are certain chemical reactions of the body lead to heat production. So certain chemical reactions of the body lead to heat production. Intake of foodstuff such as carbohydrate, fat and protein produce heat, which is called specific dynamic action of food. So intake of food such as carbohydrate, fat and protein produce heat, which is known as specific dynamic action of food. Exercise or muscle contraction is perhaps the largest source of body heat. So perhaps the largest source of body heat is exercise or muscle contraction. Hormones such as thyroxine and catecholamines produce heat, whereas heat production by thyroxine is slow and prolonged. Catecholamines produce heat quickly for a short duration. So hormones such as thyroxine and catecholamines produce heat. There is difference between these two hormones in producing heat, whereas heat production by thyroxine is slow and prolonged. Catecholamines produce heat quickly but for a short duration. Brown fat found in infants produce considerable amount of heat by its high metabolic rate. So brown fat found in infants produce considerable amount of heat by its high metabolic rate. Now next we come to mechanisms of heat loss. The main mechanisms of heat loss are conduction. In this process, heat is transferred by contact from the body to another object in contact with it. So conduction, in this process, heat is transferred by contact from the body to another object in contact with it. Next is convection. In this process, heat is transferred from the body by the upward or downward movement of molecules such as air in contact with it. So convection, in this process, heat is transferred from the body by the upward or downward movement of molecules such as air in contact with it. For example, air in contact with the body that is warm becomes hot and lighter, and so it moves upwards to be replaced by new cold air. For example, air in contact with the body that is warm becomes hot and lighter, and so it moves upwards to be replaced by new cold air. Next is radiation. In this process, heat is transferred from the body to a distant object having a different temperature by electromagnetic waves. So in radiation, heat is transferred from the body to a distant object having a different temperature by electromagnetic waves. Now cutaneous vasodilation makes the skin warm, which helps in heat loss through the processes of conduction, convection and radiation. So cutaneous vasodilation makes the skin warm, which helps in heat loss through the processes of conduction, convection and radiation. Now next we come to heat loss by evaporation of water. So one very important means of heat loss is evaporation of water. Evaporation of water loss may be of the following types: insensible water loss, sweating and panting. So insensible water loss, this occurs at all times at an uniform rate independent of environmental influences. It occurs by diffusion to the epidermis and is not secreted by sweat glands. Insensible water loss occurs at a rate of 50 milliliter per hour. So what is insensible water loss? This occurs at all times at an uniform rate independent of environmental influences. It occurs by diffusion through the epidermis and is not secreted by sweat glands, and insensible water loss occurs at a rate of 50 milliliter per hour. Next is sweating. Water is lost in sweating in the form of secretion of sweat glands. Water is lost in sweating in the form of secretion of sweat glands. During exercise, sweating may increase to 1600 milliliter per hour. So water is lost in sweating in the form of secretion of sweat glands. During exercise, sweating may increase to 1600 milliliter per hour. Next is panting. Now rapid shallow respiration increases evaporation of water and heat loss. Rapid shallow respiration increases evaporation of water and heat loss. This is known as panting and is commonly observed in lower animals. Now, when surrounding temperature is much lower, heat loss takes place mainly through conduction, convection and radiation, while heat loss by evaporation is small. So when surrounding temperature is much lower, heat loss takes place mainly through conduction, convection and radiation, while heat loss by evaporation is small. However, if surrounding temperature is close to body temperature, evaporation becomes the major route of heat loss, while other processes become relatively minor. So when surrounding temperature is much lower, heat loss takes place mainly through conduction, convection, radiation, whereas heat loss by evaporation is small. But if surrounding temperature is close to body temperature, evaporation becomes the major route of heat loss, while other processes become relatively minor. Now we come to mechanisms of temperature regulation. Now, temperature regulating processes may be induced by cold or heat. Temperature regulating process may be induced by cold or heat. Cold induced mechanisms include those that increase heat production or decrease heat loss. Cold induced mechanisms include those that increase heat production or decrease heat loss. Now, cold induced mechanisms that increase heat production are shivering. This is involuntary contraction of skeletal muscles induced by cold. So, shivering is involuntary contraction of skeletal muscles induced by cold. Contraction of the muscles generates heat and tries to prevent fall of body temperature following exposure to cold. So, contraction of the muscles generates heat and tries to prevent fall of body temperature following exposure to cold. Now, when the environment is very cold, exposed persons without being conscious become engaged in increased physical activity such as moving hands and legs, etc. Such semi-conscious muscular activity generates heat and elevates body temperature. So when the environment is very cold, exposed persons without being conscious become engaged in increased physical activity such as moving hands and legs, etc. Such semi-conscious muscular activity generates heat and elevates body temperature. Increased secretion of catecholamines is another response to cold, helping to generate heat. So increased secretion of catecholamines is another response to cold, helping to generate heat. Now, cold-induced mechanisms that decrease heat loss are cold exposed persons often lie in bed in a curled up position. This decreases the exposed body surface area and reduces heat loss. So, cold exposed persons often lie in bed in a curled up position. This decreases the exposed body surface area and reduces heat loss. Cutaneous vasoconstriction occurs in response to local as well as reflex effects of cold. Cutaneous vasoconstriction occurs in response to local as well as reflex effects of cold. Cutaneous vasoconstriction prevents blood from coming into the skin and getting cooled by conduction, convection or radiation. Thus the core temperature tends to remain unaltered. So cutaneous vasoconstriction prevents blood from coming into the skin and getting cooled by conduction, convection or radiation. Thus the core temperature tends to remain unaltered. The contraction of arrectoris pylorum muscle leads to erection of hairs entrapping a layer of air between them. Contraction of arrectoris pylorum muscles leads to erection of hairs entrapping a layer of air between them. This layer of air reduces the transfer of heat from the body across it to the outer air. This mechanism is rather poor in man because of sparse hair, but it is important in other hairy animals. So the layer of air which is entrapped in the skin, entrapped over the skin due to contraction of arrectoris pylorum muscles, reduces the transfer of heat from the body across it to the outer air. This mechanism is rather poor in man because of sparse hair, but is important in other hairy animals. Now, heat-induced mechanisms include those that increase heat loss or that decrease heat production. So, heat-induced mechanisms are those that increase heat loss or that decrease heat production. So, heat-induced mechanisms that increase heat loss are cutaneous vasodilation. Cutaneous vasodilation occurs in response to increased body temperature. Cutaneous vasodilation occurs in response to increased body temperature. In such conditions, the dilated cutaneous blood vessels raise skin temperature and promote heat loss by conduction, convection, and radiation. So, cutaneous vasodilation occurs in response to increased body temperature. In such conditions, the dilated cutaneous blood vessels raise skin temperature and promote heat loss by conduction, convection, and radiation. Now, sweating is a very important means of heat loss in hot environment. Sweating is a very important means of heat loss in hot environment. As explained above, sweating leads to considerable heat loss due to evaporation of sweat, especially during exercise. Sweating leads to considerable heat loss due to evaporation of sweat, especially during exercise. Now, heat-induced mechanisms that decrease heat production are generalized lethargy and apathy in hot environment. Generalized lethargy and apathy, which we feel in hot environment, that decreases heat production by minimizing muscular activity. So, generalized lethargy and apathy decreases heat production by minimizing muscular activity. The loss of appetite in hot environment decreases heat produced by specific dynamic action of food. So, loss of appetite, which you feel in hot environment, decreases heat produced by specific dynamic action of food. Now, role of hypothalamus. The role of hypothalamus, anterior hypothalamus is activated by warmth. Anterior hypothalamus is activated by warmth, and the reflex responses mediated by it are sweating and cutaneous vasodilation. So, anterior hypothalamus is activated by warmth, and the reflex responses mediated by it are sweating and cutaneous vasodilation. The reflex responses mediated by anterior hypothalamus are sweating and cutaneous vasodilation. Posterior hypothalamus is stimulated by cold, and the reflex responses mediated by it are shivering and cutaneous vasoconstriction. So, posterior hypothalamus is stimulated by cold, and the reflex responses mediated by it are shivering and cutaneous vasoconstriction. Now we come to fever. Now, fever occurs in infections. During fever, the body temperature is raised and thermoregulatory mechanisms act to maintain body temperature at this new higher level. So, fever occurs during infections. During fever, the body temperature is raised. Thermoregulatory mechanisms act to maintain body temperature at this new higher level. The mechanism of fever production is as follows. The endotoxins or other pyrogens arising from bacteria act on monocytes and macrophages to release cytokines such as IL-1B, IL-6, beta interferon, gamma interferon, TNF alpha, etc. Toxins or other pyrogens arising from bacteria act on monocytes and macrophages to release cytokines such as IL-1B, IL-6, beta interferon, gamma interferon, TNF alpha, etc. The cytokines act at organum vasculosum of lamina terminalis, OVLT. The cytokines act at organum vasculosum of lamina terminalis, which is a circumventricular organ, and finally exert their action on preoptic area of hypothalamus. Cytokines act at organum vasculosum of lamina terminalis, which is a circumventricular organ, and finally exert their action on preoptic area of hypothalamus. This releases prostaglandins locally at the hypothalamus, causing fever. So, this releases prostaglandins locally at the hypothalamus, causing fever. Now, fever has some beneficial effects. Fever has some beneficial effects. These are: The higher temperature caused by fever diminishes the growth of bacteria. The higher temperature caused by fever diminishes the growth of bacteria. The higher temperature caused by fever diminishes the growth of bacteria. Increased temperature caused by fever is useful in the treatment of several diseases like anthrax, neurosyphilis, leprosy, pneumonia, etc. So increased temperature caused by fever is useful in the treatment of diseases like anthrax, neurosyphilis, leprosy, pneumonia, etc. So that is all about temperature regulation.